a few years ago, Hurricane Katrina damaged the city of New Orleans in what seemed like biblical proportions. And people sought to find meaning in that level of disaster as it happened. There were a number of prominent and public preachers, people like Franklin Graham, who tried to understand the meaning of this. This is something he said in a speech. He said, this is one wicked city, okay? It's known for Mardi Gras, for Satan worship. It's known for sex perversion. It's known for every type of drugs and alcohol and the orgies and all these things that go on down there in New Orleans. There's been a spiritual cloud over New Orleans for years. They believe God is going to use that storm to bring revival. John Hagee followed this. He says, New Orleans had a level of sin that was offensive to God, and they were recipients of the judgment of God for that. The newspaper carried the story in our local area that was not carried nationally, that there was to be a hedonistic parade on that Monday that Katrina came. And I believe Hurricane Katrina was, in fact, a judgment of God against the city of New Orleans. Pat Robertson didn't want to be left out of this. He said, I warn Orlando, all right, it's changing cities now, that you're right in the way of some serious hurricanes, and I don't want to be waving those flags in God's face if I were you. A condition like this will bring about destruction of your nation. It'll bring about terrorist bombs. It'll bring earthquakes, tornadoes, and possibly a meteor. He doesn't sound very sure about that last judgment. Robertson, Falwell, Pat Buchanan, John Hagee, a list of people have stood up and blamed everything from 9/11 to terrorism to earthquakes to natural disasters to everything imaginable to every kind of group or sin that they find particularly distressing. And this has led many to wonder what to make of them, if nothing else. Is this how God works? Is this how he sees the world, where a city is having some kind of sin and God sends a natural disaster? It's hard to imagine God working that way. These interpretations probably strike us as trivial, but we're forced to look at the world today and kind of wonder the opposite question of, is anyone in control? Is God in control? Just the news headlines this week: Russia runs nuclear weapons tests. China is flexing its muscles over Taiwan. There's a coup attempt in the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, led by some Americans. There's continued bloodshed in Israel, in Gaza, as the war rages on there. Take your last month and write a headline for it. Would it fit in line with these things? Maybe not in terms of scale, but in terms of intensity to you. It's easy to sit and look at what's going on and go, is anyone in control? Is anyone holding anything accountable? On the one hand, we look at sort of the trivialness of some of these televangelists and how they have interpreted events. But then on the other hand, we can look at a world that seems to be run according to chaos and wonder to ourselves, where is God? Is he in control? We're going to be looking at Daniel chapter 5 this morning. And there's a bit of a shift that's happened in the book of Daniel, where things seem to have gone from bad to worse. And if there was one stop past that, that's where they're at. In Daniel chapter 5, starting in verse 1, it says, King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of the house of the 1,000. Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold and silver that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem be brought, that the king and his lords, his wives, his concubines might drink from them. They brought in the golden vessels that had been taken out of the temple of the house of God in Jerusalem. And the kings and his lords, his wives, his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Daniel introduces a new character without any introduction. It just says King Belshazzar, and he kind of expects us to get that. So let's talk for a moment. How did we get to King Belshazzar? What happened to King Nebuchadnezzar? So a lot has happened in a span of a couple of decades that Daniel kind of just moves on directly. Honestly, this character, King Belshazzar, had all but faded off the pages of history up until the mid-1900s. Quite a few scholars in the late 1800s, early 1900s thought that Daniel, or whoever they thought the author was, had just made up this character kind of out of thin air. Well, a bunch of discoveries that happened in the mid-19th centuries. There's about 37 historical texts and references, inscriptions, and whatever else that have been uncovered in ancient Babylon as they've continued to do digs there that have actually pointed to the fact that this is a real guy. In fact, this actually makes the case that the date of the book is quite early. I know I keep hitting that again and again, but I think that's so essential because some of Daniel's prophecies, they are so specific and accurate that people have doubted that it was written by Daniel in the time that it was. They think it's a later memoir of someone writing about events that had already happened in the past. But it is a very impressive book in the sense that God is actually at work. If the book was written later, the writer would not have known who Belshazzar was to include him in the book in the first place. So the fact that the name Belshazzar is being written means whoever wrote the book, and it's Daniel, as I'm telling you it is, Daniel, as he wrote the book, knew of King Belshazzar, as the story tells us. But King Nebuchadnezzar dies in 563, and he's succeeded by one of his sons. His name is Amel-Marduk, or basically a man of Marduk. Marduk was their chief god, and this guy is just named, he's this chief god's man. This is the same king from 2 Kings 25 who released King Jehoiakim from prison. And so he allowed King Jehoiakim to be in the royal court there and have a front row seat to that. But he was assassinated by his brother-in-law. And this was one of Nebuchadnezzar's generals who had led the siege in Jerusalem. This man assumed the throne, and then he died 4 years later, and he was succeeded by his son, who was assassinated 9 months later. So they've gone through quite a few successions of kings here. And then finally, the man who takes the throne is a man by the name of Nabonidus. He has no relation to the royal family whatsoever. He came into power, and in an attempt to sort of seal in his legitimacy, he marries one of King Nebuchadnezzar's daughters. So at least he's trying to reconnect his reign to the previous long-established ruler. And then he has a son named Belshazzar who ruled with him, who ruled with Nabonidus, and became king after his death in 539. So we've got a span of 30-ish years here. During all of this time, though, the Persian Empire is growing. They've been growing, and they have began invading Babylonian lands. In fact, right before this chapter happens, not in the text but in history, King Nabonidus had gone out to war against the Persians, and he had lost a battle and was actually killed in that battle, which is why we see Belshazzar. This is potentially his coronation feast. We don't know exactly what it is. But that is the moment when he had become king. So they're at this essentially drunken party right as their world is falling apart, right as the Persians are coming in. Daniel, at this point in his life, he's probably somewhere, people estimate, between his late 60s and his early 80s. So the book begins with him as kind of a teenager and follows a lot of his early life, and then it kind of leaves off until this chapter when it picks up again, kind of probably calling him out of retirement a little bit. Now, the text calls him, says King Belshazzar, who's the son of Nebuchadnezzar. And it references this again and again. And you just heard me say, well, he's actually the son of Nabonidus. And so we have to ask the question, in what sense is the text calling him Nebuchadnezzar's son? There's one theory which says, well, he's an actual son, and so the daughter that Nabonidus married already had a son, and this was a son that he adopted, again, to kind of seal in his legitimacy. He ruled with this son together, and that would kind of bring the King Nebuchadnezzar's line back in the forefront. That's one theory. It's possibly true. We don't know. Another sense, which is equally possible, is the phrase son and father is used metaphorically quite often in ancient times. Even in the Bible, there's an argument, a particular argument that the Gospels record that Jesus had with the Pharisees. And the Pharisees said, what to Jesus? They said, your father is Beelzebub. Our father is Abraham. Now, genetically, that's not true of either case. Right? What are they saying when they say that? They're saying, look, our source, the one that we are aligned with, identified with, have the authority of, the one that we're accountable to, that's our Father. And so I think this is at least probably the way that it's being used here to say that Belshazzar is the son of Nebuchadnezzar, at least in the sense that he is his source. He's the one that he's identified with, he's aligned with. Now this party, it says he's got 1,000 people at this party. There's a lot of drinking going on. He has his wives, he has his concubines. This is probably quite the wild event. Read between the lines here. It's probably quite the wild event. And they decide, hey, let's go grab all of the golden utensils. Let's grab the cups and such that my father took out of the temple. For that whole Jewish no-name God that we don't care anything about, that we conquered. Let's go grab those items and let's pour more wine. So there's this profaning of things that God calls holy. This is something that's a common theme throughout the Old Testament. In Leviticus chapter 10, there's these two guys, Nadab and Abihu, and they were of the priestly class, and they take these elements that the priest would use to discern God's will. We don't know exactly what they are. The priest would keep them in their breastplate, and there's no real description of what they were. People think it was maybe some way of asking God a yes/no question and him making those devices move one way or the other. We don't know. But whatever they were, Nadab and Abihu, they take these things, and it says that they made a fire with it. They started burning incense. They used the items that were for God's worship and for discerning God's will and doing his ministry. They used that essentially to do some kind of pagan ritual, to worship a false god with. God struck them dead for that. David's son mishandled the Ark of the Covenant when it was on its way back into Israel, when it was on its way back to the temple, rather. He reached up to stabilize it. It was being carried on an ox cart, which was not how it was prescribed to be carried. It was supposed to be carried on poles by the Levites. They were supposed to carry it that way, and they had put it on an ox cart, and the cart tipped, and he reaches up to stabilize it, and God strikes him. Hophni and Phinehas in 1 Samuel 4, these are the sons of Samuel. They were quite characters. They thought of the ark as some kind of magic power box. This is a weapon of war that if we bring, we're going to conquer everybody. I don't believe they believed in the God that this represented. I don't think they followed God. I think they saw this as a way to have power. And they took the ark into battle, and in this battle, God allowed it to be captured. God allowed them to be defeated. This is captured and it's brought in to the Philistine camp, put into the Philistine temple. We're seeing a pattern here where a conquering army takes something won in battle and puts it in their temple as well. They put it in the temple, and their statue Dagon falls over in the morning. They prop their God back up, and the next night he falls over and his head and his hands are cut off. Again, they persist, and eventually the people get these boils all over them, and at some point they realize, this thing is bad news, let's get rid of it, and they put it on a cart, and the oxen just carry it back off to the Jews. God is very jealous over what he calls holy, over what he calls set apart. And here we see where God is not a respecter of persons. To his own people, when they profane his items, he deals with them, he judges them. And now we see the same thing reflected on the other side with the people who are not called by his name. God holds all people to account. The story continues, and there's writing on the wall. Verse 5, it says, immediately the fingers of a human hand appeared, and he wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace opposite the lampstand. And the king saw the hand as it wrote. Then the king's color changed, and his thoughts alarmed him. His limbs gave way, and his knees locked together. The king called loudly to bring the enchanters, the Chaldeans, and the astrologers. The king declared to the wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and shows me the interpretation shall be clothed with purple, shall have a chain of gold around his neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king the interpretation. Then King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed, and his color changed, and his lords were perplexed. There's a hand, this is a classic phrase that we use in today's world. The writing is on the wall, meaning, the judgment is pronounced. The end was there. We saw it clearly. And people wonder, what is this hand? Was It's a drunken party. Was he under some kind of hallucination? Well, he shows the writing to a whole bunch of people. And so it seems that as the story relates it, that's how it was. This scene is becoming a common thing that just seems to be on repeat throughout the book. The king has something disturbing happen, and he summons all of his group. Hey, we're going to have a meeting. Let's talk about this. And so he does the same thing here. There's something disturbing, and he brings all of these people in. Again, they're not able to interpret, even though he gives them this great offer. I'm going to make you the third highest in the kingdom. I'll give you a chain of gold, a purple robe. He's giving them the signs of royalty, right? He's bringing them up. Now, the issue is, remember, who's right outside the walls? The Persians are camped out there. The Persians have just killed King Nabonidus. All of these promises are pretty worthless to make them the third in a kingdom which is about to be destroyed. Now, they're in a city that's protected by 2 walls. I'll talk about those more in a moment, but they're sitting in here, and it still hasn't registered with the king what is going on. Now, it's odd because in a minute we're going to see that Daniel says that this is written in Aramaic. Aramaic was the language they were all speaking. The words on the wall, they were Aramaic. And so you go, well, how come they couldn't make sense of the words? It's the common tongue of the day. It's not like it was written in French or something. I mean, this is the language that they all spoke, and they're all standing there reading it going, yeah, we don't know what it says. It's possible that the words are there. If you've ever dealt in a second language, a lot of times you'll understand the words that someone is saying, and you have absolutely no clue what those words mean. You can't conjugate it into a complete sentence, a complete idea. It could be that the words are so seemingly random that it's just not registering what it means. It could be they very well know what it means, and they just don't want to give a drunken king with absolute power bad news. Not a bad approach either way. But here we see the queen come out, and she's speaking. Now the question is, whose queen is she? Is this, it can't be King Belshazzar's wife, because it already says, well, his wife and his concubines, they're all at this party together. And so some people suspect this might actually be dead King Nebuchadnezzar's wife. Could be King Nabonidus' wife. We don't know. So it's probably the queen mother is who this should be understood as being. But she comes in with some words of wisdom. It says, the queen, verse 10, because of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banquet hall. And the queen declared, O king, live forever. Let not your thoughts alarm you or your color change. There's a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. In the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom like the wisdom of the gods were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians, enchanters, Chaldeans, and astrologers, because an excellent spirit and understanding to interpret dreams and explain riddles and solve problems were found in Daniel, whom the king named Belshazzar. Now let Daniel be called in, and he will show the interpretation. Then Daniel was brought before the king. The king answered and said to Daniel, you are that Daniel, one of the exiles of Judah, whom the king my father brought from Judah. I have heard of you, that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you. Now the wise men, the enchanters, have been brought in before me to read this writing and to make known its interpretation, but they could not show the interpretation of the matter. But I've heard that you can give interpretations and solve problems. Now, if you can read the writing and make known to me the interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. The way the queen talks about Daniel, it seems like she really knows him, which is why people who are trying to figure out, well, if it's not King Belshazzar's wife, which queen is this? And it's obviously a queen who had a front row seat to the work that Daniel was doing with King Nebuchadnezzar. She calls him by his Hebrew name twice. She must have known him really well to know his Hebrew name. She must have liked him enough to call him by his Hebrew name. She's been an eyewitness to whatever has been going on in King Nebuchadnezzar's court. And she says, look, here's this man. He is the spirit of the living God. He is the wisdom of the gods. He brings light. She says he's able to solve difficult problems. Literally, it's a metaphor, which means he's able to untie difficult knots. It's always fun to take children fishing I mean that quite sarcastically, because you as the adult will just spend your whole day baiting hooks, pulling fish off, and untying knots. And fishing line is such where you can't just pull the ends and it unties. You have to kind of pick at it a bit. He's able to loosen these knots. He's able to pick through a problem. Now, Belshazzar, by contrast, the queens seem to know Daniel. Belshazzar seemed to be oblivious. Now, why is he oblivious? It's possible that he represents a new regime. Actually, he's 4 regimes later. A lot of times when a new regime comes in, all of the people who served in the previous government are kind of suspect as being an ally to the previous kings. And so it could be that is why Daniel was let go out of service long ago. It could be that the king was simply unaware of Daniel. Daniel might have been retired at this point in life. He might have been just sitting back in the shade somewhere. Again, he's late 60s to early 80s. So it's likely that King Belshazzar is summoning him out of retirement. King Belshazzar could have also just been drunk as a skunk and not known which way was up at this point in the party to know who was Daniel. So any of these are possible reasons as to why he's somewhat oblivious. But Daniel begins to speak now to the king, and he tells him there's a lesson that you have not learned yet. Verse 17, then Daniel answered and said before the king, let your gifts be for yourself, and give your rewards to another. Nevertheless, I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation. O king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father kingship and greatness and glory and majesty. And because of the greatness that he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he would, he killed, and whom he would, he kept alive. Whom he would, he raised up, and whom he would, he humbled. But when his heart was lifted up and his spirit was hardened so that he dealt proudly, he was brought down from his kingly throne, and his glory was taken away from him. He was driven from the children of mankind, and his mind was made like that of a beast, and his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. He was fed grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, until he knew that the Most High God rules the kingdoms of mankind and sets over it whom he will. And you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all of this. But you have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven, and the vessels of his house have been brought in before you. And you and your lords, your wives, your concubines have drunk wine from them, and you have praised the gods of silver and gold and bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see or hear or know, but the God in whose hand is your breath, and whose are all your ways, you have not honored. Daniel begins his speech quite differently than the last speech recorded in Daniel. There's a lot of contrasting that we can do between how was the last chapter dealing with Nebuchadnezzar versus this chapter. How was Nebuchadnezzar's response versus Belshazzar's response? Daniel doesn't have that reluctancy that he had in his last interaction with King Nebuchadnezzar. He was very reluctant and hesitant to give him bad news. Daniel seems very willing to speak. But the first thing he does is he rejects the king's gifts. He says, look, let your gifts be for somebody else. Daniel, I think, one, he knows that they're about to be worthless gifts. And two, he wants the king to know that he's not doing this for money. He's not motivated by the financial gain that he might have for this service. He's doing this out of the goodness of his heart. But he instructs the king from history. He starts talking about his father. He says, look, God gave your father a kingdom. Everybody was under this kingdom. Everybody trembled at his name. Everyone feared him and they respected him. God did all of this stuff, and yet his heart was proud. He was lifted up. And so God humbled him. Now, Daniel seems to be suggesting that in this whole interaction with King Nebuchadnezzar, that Nebuchadnezzar learned from this experience. That God humbled him, and at the end of his days, he understood, he finally learned the lesson, God is the one in control. This is something that Daniel flips on his head with Belshazzar. In verse 22, he says, you, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all of this. You've not humbled your heart, though you knew all of this. Here's the contrast, verse 21. He was driven from among the children of mankind. His mind was like that of a beast. At the end of that verse, it says, until he knew that the Most High God rules the kingdoms of mankind and he sets over it whom he will. There's this repentance that we see, or this at least humbling, this brokenness that we see from Nebuchadnezzar. But the contrast with Belshazzar is, you have not learned this. You lifted up your head, verse 23, against the Lord of heaven. The vessels of his house have been brought in before you. Your lords, your wives, your concubines have drunk wine from them. And they've done this all in the honor of these false gods. Belshazzar did not learn. He was proud. He took God's items and he uses them in a drunken party to toast to his pagan gods. He did not honor the one true God. Now, put yourself in Belshazzar's mindset just for one moment. It's easy to think, well, if you believe that your God is the God and these other gods are false gods, what harm is it to take the stuff from their temples and use it however you want? The issue is that's how we think about religion. Like, if our God exists, then other gods do not. And if their God exists, then other gods do not. But that's not their mind back here in this day. Remember the story of the ark getting taken? Where does it taken to? It's put in the temple next to an idol, right? They don't not believe in the God of Israel. They go, hey, great, we have another one. Let's collect all 9. And every kingdom that they conquer and every god that they capture, it's more power, right? These are power objects to them. And so Belshazzar is not thinking, well, this Yahweh God, this God of the Hebrews that's obscure and lost his war, but he's not thinking, well, this guy doesn't exist. He's thinking, okay, our God is more powerful, but in his mindset, his worldview, both systems exist and he's just blending them together. So even in his own mindset, he is doing something somewhat sacrilegious. Finally, in this chapter, we see that there's an inglorious end. Verse 24 says, then from the presence, the hand was sent, and this writing was inscribed. And this is the writing that was inscribed, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin. This is the interpretation of the matter. Mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought them to an end. Tekel, you've been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Then Belshazzar gave the command, and Daniel was clothed with a purple chain of gold, was put around his neck, and a proclamation was made about him that he should be the 3rd ruler in the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. So Daniel finally, when he's done saying, let me interpret it for you, but first I want to give you a speech. So he's done with his speech and he says, look, here's the interpretation. And he says the words to him. Now, the words in noun form, essentially these are monies. If you think about one of the parables that Jesus talks about, he talks about the parable of the minas or minas, where there's a man who goes away to be king and he leaves his servants with a lot of money and they have to do business in his name while he's gone. Well, that was the money that he gave them, the minna. So he's saying minna, shekel and a half. That's the literal translation of the words, which is probably why the king's wise men couldn't understand it. Is something's written on the wall, but it's just prices, it's just denominations of money, penny, nickel, and a $50, right? That's what he's saying, to put it in our vernacular. But Daniel reads this not as a noun form. He switches these to verbs, and instead he says it's numbered, weighed, and divided. Numbered, weighed, and divided. God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought them to an end. You've been weighed in the balances and found wanting, and your kingdom is divided. It's not cut in half. It's divided away from you. It's taken away from you. Now, this should not actually be surprising to King Belshazzar. This is the end of his life, and later in the next couple chapters, we're going to see where Daniel is talking about the years during his reign. So the way that Daniel has constructed the book, he's starting with the final dramatic closing scene of Belshazzar's life. But in chapter 8, he talks about being in a particular year of King Belshazzar, and in that year, he prophesied that Babylon would fall to the Persians. And so Belshazzar, maybe he didn't hear it, maybe they weren't talking to each other, I don't know, but Daniel had already prophesied that the kingdom was going to fall. More than that, Isaiah had already named Cyrus by name 150 years before this. You can look that up later in Isaiah 44. in chapter 45. He names Cyrus by name as the one who's going to come in and take and conquer Babylon. Jeremiah prophesied that there would be a drunken party as part of this downfall. Jeremiah 51:57 says, I will make drunk her officials, her being Babylon, and her wise men, her governors, her commanders, and her warriors. They shall sleep a perpetual sleep and not wake, declares the King, whose name is the Lord of hosts. So Isaiah prophesies by name, King Cyrus is going to be coming, and this is what's going to happen. Jeremiah says, look, there's going to be a drunken feast. They will sleep and be no more. Now, Daniel doesn't seem to care to tell us much about this historic event. It's an amazing transfer of power, and all he cares about is this writing on the wall scene. Thankfully, Herodotus and Xenophon, they fill in some details for us. These are ancient historians. The double walls that surrounded Babylon, these were formidable. It was a fortress. They're 25 feet wide, each wall. So there's an interior wall and an exterior wall, each of them 25 feet wide and about 40 feet tall. The outer wall, just to give you a sense of scale of what was Babylon at the time, the outer wall made a 17-mile loop. This was a big, protected city. It seemed to be impenetrable. Now, the Persians were crafty. The Euphrates River flowed through the cities, or one of the little split-offs flowed through the cities, and this was perfect. You have a big wall. You're in a fertile farming delta, a river delta, and you have a constant water supply. You're safe. You're good to go. People can siege you all day, and there's no problem. You have enough land inside the city that you can plant, you can harvest, you can have animals, you have a water source. You just wait for them to get bored and go somewhere else. And I think perhaps this is why the king is sitting down having this party. He's not worried. He thinks everything's going to be fine. We're Babylon. What can happen to us? The Persians, though, did a massive effort. They diverted the Euphrates. They were able to lower the water level enough so that the soldiers were able to wade through the water at chest deep and make it under the gates that they had protecting the water. The soldiers stormed the city. They find the king in the throne room, and they very quickly do away with him. These historians note that the city was attacked while there was a festival going on. This is outside the Bible source referencing this festival going on. In fact, they say this is why these kings chose to attack on this night, was because of this festival. So they took the city without a fight. The Nabonidus Chronicle, the Cyrus Cylinder, these also describe the battle and give some other details as well. Daniel closes with, that very night, Belshazzar the Chaldean was killed, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom. Here's that word received. We see that in various forms where we say, well, God gave or someone received. In this book, even though God's people are trapped in this place, even though you have these maniacal leaders requiring all kinds of stuff from their people, it's very clear in the language that Daniel is using that God is the one allowing them. He is the one giving the people into their hand. Remember Daniel 1, the book opens with, the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into the hand and some of the vessels of the house of the God. God gave them into his hand. God gave the kingdom to Darius the Mede. Even when everything seems to be going crazy, God is in control. He is the one saying, I'm taking the kingdom from you, and I'm handing the kingdom to you. All of these men, even the ones who are not believers, who are not following God, who are not walking with God, they are God's stewards. Whether they know it or not, that is the reality, and God holds them accountable. God is able to bring one empire up, and he's able to take another empire down. What does all of this mean for us? First, most clearly, God is sovereign over empires. He sets them up, he tears them down. Proverbs 29:2 says, when the righteous increase, the people rejoice, but when the wicked rule, the people groan. God is able to do this. At the same time, sometimes it's hard for us to make the leap from how does God take an empire, raise an empire, or crush an empire? What does that have to do with us? We're not exactly empire leaders in this room, are we? And I would say if we scale that down to our own life circumstances, God is able to cause something to happen. God is able to stop something from happening. Talk with people about the sort of spiritual journey that they've been on in their life. And for someone who's had enough life experience, they'll probably all talk about some time when uncontrollable circumstances were just hammering them, and it didn't seem like they could do anything to get out of it. And then at some point, like a switch is flipped, that ceases. God is able to allow us to walk through times of suffering and walk through times of pain. And God is able to end all of that. And he does this for his own reasons. He does this according to his own wisdom, for his own purposes. He does this for our good. He does it for his glory. Next, we see that God will punish everyone who profanes his honor. We use that word profane on purpose. Profane is to take something that is sacred, that is set apart, that's cleansed, that's holy, and to use it for common usages, right? To take the vessels of the temple and to serve wine to your drunken party out of would be an example of that. But everything in our world belongs to God. The whole earth is his, not just the temple. See, our understanding of what is holy and sacred is so much greater than it's the Holy of Holies, it's the temple, it's Jerusalem. Our understanding is Psalms 24:1, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. We look in the New Testament and Paul talks about ourselves as the temple. We are the temple. There's no more temple in Jerusalem. We are the temple of the Holy Spirit. We are God's temple. We are his house. Are we profaning these things that God has given us? This is the message for the pagan kings who worship other gods, but it's also the message for God's people. When they profaned his things, he took them out. When the pagan kings profaned his things, he took them out. What hope do we have if we choose to profane what God calls holy? Here's our hope. This comes from Ezekiel. This is chapter 36. I'm going to close with reading this. In Ezekiel, it says, I scattered them among the nations, and they were dispersed through the country. So it's talking about this time. In accordance with their ways and their deeds, I judged them. But when they came to the nations, wherever they came, they profaned my holy name, in that the people said of them, these are the people of the Lord, and yet they had to go out of his land. But I had concern for my holy name, which is the house of Israel, had profaned among the nations to which they came. Therefore say to the house of Israel, thus says the Lord God, it is not for your sake, O house of Israel, that I'm about to act, but for the sake of my holy name, which you have profaned among the nations to which you came. And I will vindicate the holiness of my great name, which has been profaned among the nations, and which you have profaned among them. And the nations will know that I am the Lord, declares the Lord God, when through you I vindicate my holiness before their eyes. I will take you from the nations, gather you from all of the countries, and bring you into your own land. I will sprinkle clean water on you, and you shall be clean from all your uncleanness. And from all your idols I will cleanse you. And I will give you a new heart and a new spirit I will put within you. And I will remove the heart of stone from your flesh and give you a heart of flesh. I want you to close your eyes just for a moment, and I want to lead us in some prayer time here. But I want to start with this question. Are you taking what God has made holy and profaning it? Just imagine Jesus for a moment standing in front of you with his hand open and saying, come. This sense of profaning the holy is probably something we all live with. This is called guilt and shame. In fact, one of the lies of Satan is that the things that we've done are too bad. The places that we've gone are too far from God's presence. But this passage right here, there's nothing too bad and there's no place too far. They have profaned his name and they are away in exile. And God is telling them, I'm here to bring you back. I'm here to take away the reproach from my name that you have brought to me. I am going to make it happen. Just imagine Jesus saying this to you now. He wants to take you and he wants to make you holy again. He wants to clean you. He wants to give you a new heart and he wants to give you a new spirit. God, this is the desire of our hearts on so many days when we are trapped in sin, when we go back to habitual sins, when we lay awake at night and we feel a sense of shame and guilt. It's that you would wash us and we would be clean, that this would be done. Lord, you do this through your Son. You do this through Jesus. This is why you sent your Son, was so that his shedding of blood, his perfect life would cover us, would clean us, and we would be clean. Lord, if anyone is struggling with that this morning, I pray that you would speak to them, that they would see your hand inviting them. They're not too far. They're not too bad. There's nothing that we can do that will separate us from you when you are pursuing us. Lord, we ask this in your name.